Hello, I am Ayub Sharifi. I am an associate professor at the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences of Hiroshima University. I am also an associate professor, adjunct associate professor at the Graduate School of Advanced Sciences and Engineering of the same university. Today, I would like to give a talk on urban energy resilience for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Before starting the presentation, I would like to thank the organizers for kindly inviting me. And I would also like to apologize for not being able to join you physically. Hopefully the COVID-19 situation will stabilize very soon so that I can visit you physically. So again, the topic is on urban energy resilience. This is an important topic because, as many of you may already know, the majority of world population now lives in the cities, and this has clear impacts on the amount of energy that is consumed in cities. In fact, about 60 to 80% of global energy is now consumed in urban areas, and given the projected increase in world's urban population, this share is expected to further increase in the future. In the meantime, we have experienced a steady increase in the frequency and intensity of disasters over the past few decades. When these two forces, urbanization, rapid urbanization on the one side, and climate change impacts on the other side, are combined, they have major consequences for the continuity of energy supply in cities. As a result, we need to build on energy resilience in cities in order to ensure continuity of energy supply. Otherwise, disruptions in energy supply as a vital component of economic systems at different levels of economic activities may cost up to 1 to 2% of the annual development potential of nations and can cause serious damages to the effective functioning of their economies. In this slide, you can see that there has been a steady increase in the number of adverse events over the past few decades. Many of these adverse events are related to climate change. In fact, the adverse impacts of climate change become more apparent every passing day as we continue to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. For instance, every year we hear in the news about the record heat events or the record levels of sea level rise. Due to these impacts, presently the average annual loss from natural disasters in cities is estimated by the United Nations at over 250 billion US dollars. And in fact, if cities fail to build their resilience to disasters, this figure is likely to rise to about 314 billion US dollars by the year 2030. Another important issue is that natural disasters often do not discriminate between developed and developing countries. For instance, this is a scene from a typhoon that hit Chiba Prefecture. This is an area next to Tokyo in Japan last year, and it caused significant damages to the energy infrastructure systems. For instance, it resulted in blackouts that lasted for about 1 month, and as a result, the quality of life of the residents was seriously impacted. So in this talk, I would like to introduce a conceptual framework that I have developed for evaluating energy resilience in cities. It also includes an introduction to a list of indicators and criteria that can be used for assessing resilience. I will also touch on the possible linkages between those criteria and efforts that are needed to be taken in order to achieve climate adaptation as well as mitigation targets. Before starting, I would like to briefly explain what is meant by resilience. Resilience has its roots in fields such as psychology and physics, and in urban studies, it's still relatively a new concept that was introduced over the past few decades, to be more exact, the past 2 decades. One concept is engineering resilience. This is more related to physics that I mentioned earlier. It adopts a rigid approach to risk management and emphasizes the importance of enhancing resistance and robustness of the critical infrastructure in urban systems. And in case the critical thresholds are crossed, engineering resilience as a static concept requires a rapid recovery process that involves return to the equilibrium point. But we need to be careful in terms of promoting engineering resilience, because this requires reliance on resistance of the system, and this reliance may create a false sense of complacency that only delays the hazards, accumulates the risks, and thereby may exacerbate the disasters. And acknowledging these problems, and also acknowledging that many disasters are uncertain and unpredictable, recently ecological and adaptive approaches to resilience have been promoted in urban studies. In terms of ecological resilience, it focuses on tenacity of the system in contrast to its stability. Here, resilience is interpreted as possessing a certain level of tolerance to absorb change and disturbance, and to retain the main architecture, function, and character of the system. This implies that a system may shift to a new regime, in other words, a new equilibrium status, as long as its structure and function is unchanged. More recently, there is a conceptualization called adaptive resilience, sometimes also called socio-ecological resilience. This is a conceptualization that is developed based on the recognition of cities as complex and dynamic socio-ecological systems that constantly go through change. And according to this approach, a system undergoes change continuously and will not necessarily return to an equilibrium status. In other words, not only it needs to bounce back, but also needs to bounce forward. In terms of dominance, still the dominant approach is ecological resilience. This is good news because it shows that engineering resilience, although it's important, it might result in some cascading events in the future. So the recognition of ecological resilience is a good news. And more importantly, it can also be argued that recently the importance of adaptive resilience, recognizing the need to live with the risk and to bounce forward, has also been recognized. To better understand what is meant by resilience, we need to know about 4 different stages of disaster risk management. These are preparation, absorption, recovery, and adaptation. I would like to briefly explain them using this figure. Here you can see that the performance level can be divided as follows. First, before the occurrence of the disruptive event, that is the time indicated by a lightning symbol in this figure, preparations should be made in order to prevent possible hazards as much as possible and to reduce the potential damage in case of a disruption. But performance starts to decline instantly after the disruptive event, and initial effects are usually observed at the time that is shown as time I. This is the time of incidence. And after that, first reactions are made during the period between time D and time I. This is a stage that is critical for controlling of the conditions and also for warding off of the damage in order to prevent cascading impacts. While these absorptive responses continue, the system will reach its lowest performance level at the time that is shown as time f and this figure. This is the time of full impact. And following that, the absorbed impact, which is shown on the figure, this refers to the damage that has been prevented during the absorption stage. And this shows the effectiveness of absorptive capacity. Following that, when the system reaches its lowest level of performance, the recovery stage needs to be taken in order to return to the equilibrium level. This is a stage which usually takes longer time, as you can see on this figure. And following that, after the recovery is complete and we reach to an equilibrium state, this is when we need to also take adaptive approaches. We need to improve the adaptation in order to reach better levels of performance, in order to perform better when future risks, disasters happen. In other words, in order to bounce forward. In addition to those major characteristics, major stages, in order to better operationalize the concept of resilience, several characteristics, sometimes called principles, have also been introduced. On this slide, you can see that, for instance, these are robustness, stability, flexibility, resourcefulness, coordination capacity, redundancy, diversity, foresight capacity, independence, interdependence, collaboration, agility, adaptability, self-organization, creativity, and also efficiency. For instance, robustness refers to a system's strength to withstand short-term, acute, internal or external shocks without suffering from major degradation of the main functions. There are also other definitions for other characteristics that I skip in the interest of time. Now that we have those characteristics and also the different stages of the resilience, it's important to also link them to the concept of sustainability and also security of energy systems. For that purpose, usually 4 different features and abilities are used. One is availability, which refers to the availability of energy supply. Accessibility, whether people have access to those resources and energy supply resources. Affordability, if this mainly relates to equity and justice issues. And finally, acceptability, which mainly is related to the impacts of energy systems on the environment. So based on these 4 abilities and also the 4 stages and different characteristics that I introduced earlier, an energy resilient system can be defined as a system that allows continuous accessibility, availability, affordability, and acceptability of energy supply during different stages of disaster risk management, meaning during planning and preparation, absorption, recovery, and adaptation. And in order to achieve this continuous supply, it's important to make sure that different characteristics have been addressed. For instance, during planning and preparation stage, some characteristics such as resourcefulness, coordination capacity, redundancy, foresight capacity, collaboration, creativity, and efficiency are important. So I have used this conceptual framework in order to collect different planning and design criteria that can be used for measuring energy resilience in cities. And I've also tried to find out what's the association between those planning and design criteria and these different components of the energy system. Finally, I have also tried to understand how this different planning and design criteria can be related to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So to clarify what I just explained, here in this figure, which I have added here only for demonstration purpose, you can see, for instance, regarding the energy, there are several criteria indicators, and I have also, based on the literature and based on the opinions of experts in the field, I have found their interlinkages with the components of the urban energy resilience system. For instance, energy efficient resource use is related to absorption and adaptation stages of resilience. It's also related to A number 1, which was availability of energy, and also A number 4, which is acceptability. Finally, it's also related to characteristics such as efficiency and adaptability. So this table, again, this is only for demonstration purpose. If you're interested, I would like to refer you to this article, which provides detail about all these indicators. These are 196 indicators, and how they are linked to different components of the energy system. In this paper, in this presentation, I only briefly explain different dimensions and different criteria. So this 196 criteria that I mentioned have been divided into 5 major themes. These are infrastructure, resources, land use, urban geometry and morphology, governance, and also socio-demographic aspects. I briefly explain each of these in the next slides. And also these dimensions have some sub-dimensions. So for instance, for urban infrastructure, we have dimensions such as supply, transmission, distribution, backups and storage, green and blue infrastructure, buildings and neighborhoods, and also transportation. Regarding this dimension, I would like to emphasize, for instance, distributed energy supply systems. Distributed energy generation and transmission and supply systems can contribute to resilience by improving availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability under different conditions. A flexible energy system featuring a combination of both centralized and distributed generation facilities is needed, in fact, and it can enhance system diversity and ensure continued flow of energy during different stages of resilience. Distributed generation is essential because centralized systems have a high level of consolidation. This makes them vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. On the other hand, in contrast, decentralized systems are less sensitive to availability of remote generation and of transmission networks, and therefore they are more resilient. There is in fact evidence demonstrating how distributed generation can enable critical infrastructure to sustain fundamental functioning during extreme events by islanding from the grid. Distributed generation additionally facilitates coupling of energy production and consumption, and this is important because it reduces transportation footprint and conversion deficiencies, and also enhances acceptability of the energy system. Other benefits can also be achieved due to the fact that distributed generation is usually based on renewable energy systems that reduce emissions, and in case of systems such as combined heat and power installations, waste heat can also be recovered and utilized for other purposes. There is also evidence showing that decentralized energy systems can promote affordable energy options and serve as means of achieving and mobilizing social capital. So we need to promote decentralized energy systems in combination with centralized ones. Regarding resources, there are several subcategories such as energy, water energy nexus, and food-water energy nexus. The nexus-related criteria, in fact, relate to the importance of gaining synergistic efficiencies in resource and infrastructure management. And integrated and cyclical processes should be adopted in order to minimize negative impacts on resources and to make it possible for different infrastructure sectors to utilize the waste and byproducts of other facilities. And of course, achievement of this aim requires due attention to proximity and replacement of facilities. Another important dimension that needs to be emphasized is governance. In fact, this was the second most populous category in terms of the number of indicators. It consists of 5 subthemes and 50 criteria. In addition to technological and design qualifications, energy resilient urban systems should also feature powerful institutional mechanisms. Among other things, urban governance plays an essential role of coordinating the activities of various components of the system, monitoring conditions and performance achievement, developing pricing strategies, managing market forces, enforcing regulatory actions and policies, and developing planning strategies for knowledge transfer, community outreach, and open and broad stakeholder participation. So all these governance-related issues are important and need to be taken into account. And there is also a theme on socio-demographic aspects that is mainly focusing on issues such as human behavior. For instance, human behavior has 21 related criteria related to two subthemes, namely demographics, health and equity, and behavioral aspects. These are also essential factors for achieving urban energy resilience. For instance, while technological improvements are necessary for urban energy transition, they are not sufficient as anthropogenic activities and demand are among the main forces causing vulnerability in the energy systems. Addressing these vulnerabilities and improving energy resilience could not be achieved unless citizens agree to participate and change their behavior. Therefore, it is necessary to understand and acknowledge the importance of promoting co-evolution of social, behavioral, and also technological elements. Finally, there is a dimension on land use and urban form. This covers various issues related to physical form of the cities, related to land use, urban morphology, urban geometry, and passive design. For instance, at the bottom of this slide, you can see several configurations for streets. It is shown in the literature that a diagonal grid with 45 degrees diagonal orientation of cardinal points leaves every street with some direct sunlight during winter months and also some shadow during most of the summer days. This is, of course, for some particular climates in the Northern Hemisphere. And it shows how like designing streets can help us achieve thermal comfort in cities without consuming lots of energy. Other related issues to land use and urban form are, for instance, passive design. This can cover a wide range of techniques and measures, for instance, related to insulation of buildings, related to shading, to natural ventilation using downdraft evaporative cooling systems, for instance, improving thermal capacity of the materials, taking into consideration of the issue of building orientation, improving, increasing urban albedo, and also using some other techniques such as green roofs and green infrastructure systems. Related to this, we also have, for instance, blue infrastructure, some techniques such as having ponds at the top of roofs, improved waterscape in cities in order to improve thermal comfort, and other issues such as improvements in connectivity, grid angle orientation, or aspect ratio. For instance, connectivity in terms of street connectivity may have significant implications in terms of accessibility of people to different locations in cities. And if this is combined with other measures such as mixed urban use, it can have significant implications for the amount of energy that is used in cities, because it may reduce the need to drive, and through that walkability improvements, it provides energy resilience benefits. So again, for each of these indicators, I have linked them to different abilities and different sustainability criteria and different characteristics. Again, for instance, here, diversification of energy supply is related to planning and absorption. It's related to availability and accessibility of energy systems, and it also improves the diversity and diversification characteristics of resilience. So for all of these indicators combined together, I found out that in terms of abilities, these are mainly related to planning, followed by absorption capacity, but they also contribute to adaptability and also to recovery, although recovery is more limited compared to the others. In terms of sustainability, they mainly contribute to availability, followed by acceptability and affordability. In terms of overall relevance to different resilience characteristics, it is found that planning and design criteria implemented in cities are mainly related to efficiency, diversity, resourcefulness, and also adaptive capacity. In terms of mitigation and adaptation, some interesting findings were observed. First, I need to briefly mention what's meant by mitigation and adaptation. According to IPCC, mitigation is an anthropogenic intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. And adaptation is adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate effects. So I found out that most of the criteria identified in this study are related to both mitigation and adaptation. Percentage of criteria related to adaptation only and mitigation only are respectively about 24 and 1%. This is in contrast with the dominant thinking in the literature, which defines resilience as a concept mainly related to adaptation. So it shows that through planning and design criteria related to energy resilience, we can achieve both mitigation and adaptation. Again, for more details, I would like to refer you to the main article. So to have final remarks, one major issue that needs to be highlighted is that decisions related to one component are likely to affect the other components too. This is something that I explained under the nexus issue, and it highlights the complex, interconnected, and multifaceted nature of energy resilience as a synergistic concept, and underpins the importance of adapting a systemic approach towards its improvement. In other words, efforts related to improving the state of these components should not be taken in isolation from each other. As exemplified by the water, food, energy nexus, the same applies to the issue of compliance with the resilience criteria, and they should not be pursued independently. Overall, the conceptual framework and criteria that were introduced in this study can be used as an important preliminary step for development of tools for assessing urban energy resilience. Assessment tools, as briefly mentioned in the introduction, are useful for informing decision-making by local authorities. In fact, such tools can be used for three main purposes: for capturing complexity and effectively simplifying the route to resiliency, to benchmark and measure resilience and track achievement of goals. I'm happy that this framework has been used by several colleagues over the past 2 years to benchmark energy resilience of different cities across the world. And I hope some colleagues in China would also be interested in benchmarking performance of different Chinese cities using the criteria introduced in this presentation. Also, before recommending that, in addition to that, I need to also mention some challenges that need to be addressed. For instance, inclusion of a large number of criteria for assessment may raise concerns about data availability for conducting assessment. And this is something that if colleagues in China are interested in benchmarking performance of different cities, they may need to deal with it. Of course, there are some tools such as principal component analysis that can be used to reduce the number of the indicators, because access to the required data might be challenging that needs to be thought about. Also, implementing most of this criteria that I mentioned in this presentation we would probably be very challenging, because it requires a lot of resources and it may be costly. So this is something to also think about, how to implement all these resilience indicators and criteria in a cost-efficient manner. And of course, it is the responsibility of us, the scientific community, to communicate with the citizens and also with the local authorities, and show them how investments today, investments on energy resilience in cities could save the city a lot of money and resources in the future. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that currently about 250 billion US dollars is lost in cities due to disasters, and this may increase in the future. So through improving energy resilience in particular, we may save a lot of cost, and this would be of interest to policymakers. At the end, again, I would like to refer you to this article for more details, because in the interest of time, I cannot explain everything in detail here. So that's all for my presentation. Thanks again for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to respond to them. And following the conference, again, if you have further questions, please feel free to reach me through this email address. I would be happy to respond to your questions. Thank you very much and have a good day.